guest in Simon O'Connor. As Paul said, my name is Snil Sharma and I'll be conducting the majority of this session. It's an absolute pleasure to have two New Zealand politicians on our platform, the leader of the opposition and the leader of the New Zealand National Party, in Judith Collins, and Simon O'Connor, a member of the New Zealand House of Representatives. First of all, how are you both? And I guess we're coming towards a year since we've all been affected by COVID-19. So how has life been for the past year?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the introduction. First off, can I just introduce Simon O'Connor? So Simon is a Member of Parliament for the seat of Tamaki in Auckland. He's also the Associate Spokesperson for the National Party in Foreign Affairs. And he is, in addition, I've asked him to take over a role as our lead person in discussions around CANZUK, the Canadian, Australia, New Zealand and UK alliance that is something that's being particularly promoted from Canada, but also we've discussed it with the UK. So I just think it's quite helpful to have Simon join us today as we discuss things. We're in a new form of another lockdown, but it's not a very hard lockdown. We've had what we call level 3 lockdown in Auckland, which is our major city due to the population, just for 3 days. So it was the strangest thing to suddenly race into lockdown and then we're back out to a level 2. And if level 1 is pretty much close to normal, level 2 is not that far away. So we've been in and out of lockdown within a week, which I think is going to be very hard for people when there's no certainty or no particular reason why we're in or out. We had 3 cases in the country on Sunday and then we were in lockdown, and we got 3 more cases yesterday and we came out of lockdown. So I'm just a questioning of the government at the moment is about quite where the consistency is and quite how we can tell what's going on. As you imagine what's like, particularly for smaller businesses trying to cope with this. We wanted to generally talk, New Zealand's in the height of our summer at the moment, so everyone's happy and actually sunshine. So we've got the America's Cup events going on. We're still having major parties and weddings and things, just depends which part of the country. So we're in a better situation than many parts of the world. But the issue really is, at the moment, is 2 issues. One is about vaccinations, because we've only recently got enough vaccinations for our border-facing workers, for enough for 30,000 people, which is essentially the border-facing workers. And the rest of the country, we don't have any vaccinations in yet. We seem to be very much at the end of the queue. In addition to that, we have a situation where we are trying to push the government on saliva swabs rather than, or instead, as well as the nasal swabs that we all know of. The government seems very, not wanting to actually proceed down that path. So there are issues there that we can see ourselves being shut off from the rest of the world, which may well keep us safe from COVID, but will not. Without mass immunisation, we are going to end up with no herd immunity and no ability to travel without those vaccinations. So these are issues that we're prosecuting at the moment, but we're also very aware that in New Zealand, that when we over-prosecute it or seen as being negative, it can have a flow-on effect to assist people worrying that something bad's going to happen, and then they sort of start enjoying what the government's saying. So we're just very careful about that. So anyway, so Mel, if you wanted to ask any questions or anything now, it'd be a great time.
It's great to hear your take on what's going on in New Zealand. What was the reasoning behind the current lockdown? It's not, if I'm honest, been hugely documented in this country, so it'd be interesting to know what the actual reasoning was.
Well, we would find it interesting to know too. And what we know is that the Ministry of Health knew of 3 cases of the UK variant, and within half a day, the country was in, Auckland was in a level 3 lockdown, which meant, you know, gatherings no more than 10 people. A lot of people couldn't go to work, and a border restriction around Auckland for the rest of the country. And what we were told, because it was the UK variant and they weren't quite sure where it came through or how it came through, that they needed to lock down the country. And then yesterday we got 3 more cases from the same, let's say, close contacts of the first 3, and we came out of the lockdown. So we're seeking some question. We're going to be questioning in Parliament today around some consistency and just quite where the messaging is and what the criteria are. So I think it was possibly it was a situation where we're finding the consistency lacking.
Yeah, the UK, like a lot of countries across the globe, has really suffered from COVID-19, and you guys in New Zealand, on the other hand, seem to have had considerably less. You've been less affected. I think you've had 26 deaths that have been recorded. Why do you think New Zealand hasn't suffered as much as some of the other countries?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, for a start, we're at the end of the world. It's very easy to close off our borders, and our borders are, we don't have land borders. We are, even though the UK doesn't really have land borders other than within the UK, you're only a hop, step and a skip and a jump away from Europe. We are 3.5 hours flight in a modern jet from our nearest neighbour. So we're a very long way away. And so the borders are essentially the cargo ships coming in and the air flight. So it's quite easy to lock it down. The issue is that where we have had COVID-19, it's all come through those borders, of course. And the facilities, the MIQ or managed isolation quarantine facilities, have essentially just been hotels that have been changed into being these facilities. That's where EMI has come in. But I think we are fortunate because we are a small population. We don't have the density of habitation that, say, the UK has, because even though we have only 5 million people, we're actually physically larger than the UK. So we've got a lot of spread out. And so our rural communities have been, from memory, entirely unaffected. It's and that's simply because people don't live very close to each other. So I think that's it too, and the fact that we went into quite a severe lockdown to start with, and people got the message. I think too, New Zealanders saw what was happening in the rest of the world, because our media tends to, a lot of New Zealanders watch overseas media, and we saw what it was, that people did take it very seriously.
I think it's an interesting point. It's something that's raised quite a lot on our platform, is our population density is one of the largest across the globe, so it hasn't helped in times like this. I wanted to go back a few years and start to understand your journey into politics. You're obviously a lawyer by profession before becoming elected to Parliament in 2002 as the National MP for Clevedon. When did you decide that you wanted to be involved in politics?
Well, I really started to get interested in politics, involved in when National was in government and was about to lose the 1999 election. And because it was such a hopeless cause, I thought I might get myself involved. So I got involved as a volunteer. So I came from, as you say, I'm a lawyer, but I'd also been in business, but I came in from the point of view of helping as a volunteer. And I ended up essentially putting my hand up to be a candidate in 2002 when we were clearly not going to win again. And it was sort of, again, something of a hopeless cause. And the party needed people to come through who could have a strength of conviction, which I thought was lacking at that stage. So I ended up becoming selected. The number one, the final reason why I put my hand up to be an MP was when an existing Member of Parliament took me aside to tell me I should not do this, that I could just wait until he left his seat and then I could take it over. And I'd been a volunteer long enough by that stage to know that that wasn't actually how it works. So I decided I definitely have to do it. So that's what I did. And then, you know, I've had so far a 19-year career in politics.
I've been reading about some of your inspirations in your political career, and a lot of our listeners in the UK will be very proud and happy to see that Margaret Thatcher was one of them. We actually had one of her cabinet ministers on our platform recently who spoke very highly of her. What was it that made you admire her so much?
Well, one of the things, I mean, I was in New Zealand, obviously, in the 1970s and 80s, and to see the way that Margaret Thatcher had a very clear vision for how to repair the damage wrought by essentially socialist government and what was essentially as well a Marxist trade union movement in the UK, that she gave hope and vision to the UK. I also well remember this sort of vision of this rather small woman just stating very clearly the way things were, and with a great deal of humour as well, that she was, I think, one of the great icons of our time. And I also enjoyed the fact that she understood that things like the opening up of the purchasing of council houses by their tenants, that she understood the aspirations of working people, and that she wasn't simply concerned about those who already had been born with wealth, that she was very much aware of the fact she had to think of and understand those aspirations. So I felt she was a trailblazer. Obviously, she wasn't perfect, as none of us are, but I did feel her very clear thinking and was really helpful to not only the UK, but to actually the Western world.
Before we start to move to sort of foreign affairs, and it would be great to hear some of your comments on that, Simon. In the UK, it's been well documented, you know, how it can be difficult for women in politics. You know, we are seeing a rise in more women being involved, but there are some pitfalls and challenges that they face that maybe men don't. Do you think there has been a significant improvement, and what was your experience like, especially in New Zealand?
Well, it's not perfect, but nobody ever said it would be, did they? I think we were helped in some ways because National had the first woman Prime Minister of New Zealand with Jenny Shipley, followed by Labour's Helen Clark, then now followed by Jacinda Ardern for Labour. I think one of the things is that is, but none of those people have had an easy run. I mean, Jacinda Ardern's probably had the best run of all, but certainly both Helen Clark and Jenny Shipley struggled with the fact that if they were strong and decisive, that they would be seen as masculine and unwomanly and uncaring. And at the same time, if they were all those other things, the traditional female values as such or virtues, they would then be seen as not intelligent enough or not clever enough or not strong enough. So I think they just went with their gut in both cases and were quite strong and dynamic leaders. But it's yeah, there are different judgments. And look, we can always worry about those things, or we can just get on and do the best we can. And I think that's the best way to go, is just understand that look, you know, there are people in the world who, you know, have ginger hair, and they say that people are mean to gingers, and we have, you know, this. But being a woman in politics is not for the faint-hearted. Actually, being in politics is not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah, this interesting. We talk about women and, you know, in politics, and National Party has quite a good record in some of their members of Parliament and some of their activists as well. what are some of the long-term challenges facing the National Party? But it'd be good to get both of your inputs on this. You know, we saw 8 years of the John Key administration from 2008, and then we saw Bill English for a year. But you know, we've now had 4 years of Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party. How does the National Party begin to close that gap?
Well, it's a very challenging time, as every party that goes into opposition finds. And you know, you'll think back to the time the Conservatives have been in opposition. You have to take some time to find your way through as a party. And in our case, we had factions, we had all those sorts of things, all the classic things that go wrong when a party moves out of government or gets moved out of government, with various people thinking they could do the better job. And the problem with that is that all that happens under our system, we tend to, the first election after a loss, we tend to do worse. So it's the second one we tend to come back and hopefully win, or occasionally not, and go on to the next one. So I think it's always about staying focused. The other thing is we tend to lose a lot of good people, and we gain good people, but those good people, with their enthusiasm and drive, we often don't have the experience, and that's one of the issues too. So it's about making sure we have a good combination. One of the things too, of course, is that the Labour Party in opposition tends to be quite radical, and when they move into government, they try to look more centrist and try to start looking a bit more like us. And you know, you would have seen the same. You saw that with Tony Blair, so they start to hoover up some votes of ours, just as Blair did to the Conservatives. And we can react to that by going even more centrist, or else we could go the other way. I think sometimes we just have to just sit back and watch, and then come at the right time on things. So one of the things that we're trying to do very much at the moment, and this is one of the reasons I'm interested in CANZUK so much, is looking out with a vision for the future, rather than muddling around in what's happening at the moment so much, thinking about how we can also have a transformational vision for New Zealand, because we certainly haven't had a delivery of transformation in New Zealand from the current government. We've had the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern came in with this message that she was only in politics to end child poverty. Well, it's actually got worse, and that was before COVID. So we will point these things out, but we ourselves need to have our own vision for the country, and that's what we're really working on at the moment.
It's interesting you mentioned child poverty. We'll come to that shortly. I want to touch on the CANZUK agreement, and you know, it's a relationship that's been discussed in great detail on this platform. The ties that bind the United Kingdom with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you know, they're incredibly strong, and yes, they are linguistic and historic, but they're also based on families, friendship, shared, mature democratic systems of governance, underpinned by the rule of law. What do you see the future of CANZUK, and do you think one day it could almost form its own bloc?
Yeah, I see no reason why we shouldn't explore that. I think there's a very real reason to do so, and all of those things are really important, but also the adherence to the rule of law and a Westminster-style democracy, a constitutional monarchy, all of these things are very important. And as you say, they're all ties that bind us, so that when we look at CANZUK, it's not only about trade, but it's also about movement of people and a right to work. We've had a very close relationship with Australia on these I think it must be 40 years now. And what that really does is it means that we end up with very close ties personally and as well as politically and trade-wise. But we also have our frictions, and we have our competition and all those sorts of things. But I think it is important that we think more about people who think more like us when it comes to human rights, rule of law, contract, all those things that are actually part and parcel of our particular democracy. So I think there's a real opportunity, and we have, we've always had the stumbling block of the agricultural trade, particularly Canada is one of the more likely to try and block anything from New Zealand in the agricultural sense. But we are also in different hemispheres. So Australia and New Zealand, the Southern Hemisphere, UK and Canada in the Northern Hemisphere, there are real synergies there that we could actually, where we can be more complementary rather than always in desperate competition.
Is that something that, Simon, you'll be working quite a bit on, from what I understand, the CANZ UK sort of agreement?
Yeah, so the leader, Judith, asked me to work with our other parties. So you've got the likes of, well, I can see you've got James Skinner online here, so hello, James, but also across the other MPs and parliaments, particularly but not exclusively in the Conservative side, first and foremost, or the centre-right side, so we can build those ties. I think it's what Judith was saying earlier, that CANZUK is not just simply about trade, although that's important. It's about building relationships. So we see that as an opportunity as a centre-right political party, the whole freedom of movement of people. So it's a really great opportunity. And as again, Judith mentioned, we have so many shared ties. It doesn't matter if it's our constitutional monarchy or right through to our courts. We share a lot. But I think too, and it would have to be said, Sunil, that there's a few things that we've got to work through. Certainly here in New Zealand, it's probably not as much awareness of CANZUK as it is in other countries. There's also, well, we can see with some of our trade deals to date, and Judith touched on one aspect, which is agriculture. There's got to be quite a bit of give and take. So obviously, if your listeners and other CANZUK supporters would like to open their markets immediately to New Zealand products, we're there.
You know, the CANZUK has been discussed in great deal. I think generally in the UK media, on our platform, I don't think there's a single person who doesn't escape a CANZUK question, even if they're not from the CANZUK region. It's been a massive talking point. I suppose with Brexit, it's been seen as a huge opportunity for us to explore in. I've got actually a really good question here from Ella Robertson. We'll move to the Q&A from the audience a bit later, but I think this question is a really good question. It's a question that we faced quite strongly as Tories in the last government. And she's started with, I've watched all of Judith's debates. She did a brilliant job. How can we present Conservative policies best to a woke audience who want to be promised all things on tap?
Well, when you know the answer, Emma, can you let me know what it is? I think it's really hard. I understand that every generation believes that the next generation doesn't have any idea about anything. And also that, sorry, Ella, but, you know, I also think we have to be understanding that there's always generational shifts in thinking and the way in which people word the same messages. I think the National Party needs to become far more marketing focused when it comes to our messaging. And I know I have to do that too. And I mean, I'm a lawyer and a business person. I'm not actually a marketer, but I understand that is something that I need to work on, as do we. And you're right, Ella, it's very hard to actually do this. And when we have people who promise everything, but there's no thought of delivery, we've had that. Our job is to point out where they failed, but we also need to have a positive vision. And I think that's where we probably didn't do enough of that in our first term of opposition, where we were seen as sniping and negative. And yes, you do need to be hold to account or be negative about various things, but I just think we need to have more of a united vision, and we can't do that if we're constantly talking negatively. So I think that's what we need to do. And you know, Ella, a national party like the Conservative Party can never go out credibly and say everything's free and there's no payback, and everyone's going to be happy, because we'd lose our own voters who would know that that was nonsense. But yeah, I think, you know, we were actually doing very well in our polling before COVID-19 hit, and when we went to a second lockdown, that was sort of the end of it, really. So I think pointing out the failings, but having a vision to keep people safe and give people promise and hope is where we have to be.
It's a great question from Ella, and it's something we actually had Sir Linton Crosby on our platform, who advised John Howard in his government, and he gave a speech on one of the issues that Conservatives across the globe, including ourselves in the UK, faces. You know, we're very good at arguing with reason, and you know, our arguments are always very logical, and they always tend to make sense, and there's always a great economic points to them, but we sometimes lack the emotion side of things. Making that emotion in line with the reason is when you can really connect with the audience, and I think that's probably where the left do a bit better than us. They're very strong at the sort of emotional argument. I'm not sure how reasonable their arguments are, but they're definitely strong on the emotion side.
Good point.
I want to take it back to when you served in the John Key administration. You know, that was obviously 8 years of him as the Prime Minister. What was that experience like?
Well, John was a consummate politician, so and he was very capable in leadership. What I found, I had a good relationship with him, so I would. I've instituted some of the things in our party now that he used to have with the government. So as a he ran it more like a business, in which case he would say every minister has to front up with their plans for the year, how they're going to execute them, and how they'll be judged. And I've instituted that now for our caucus. So giving people some direction, some structure, and also some assistance where they need it, and giving them the answers that they need as to, is this something I should pursue? So I've done very similar to him on that. I think in some ways his leadership, the one thing where I found there are a couple of things. One that would be a complaint, and that would be from a lot of our supporters, that he didn't actually take the opportunity to use political capital to make significant changes and transform more of the New Zealand economy that he could have. And that would be a complaint that is well known in New Zealand. But that is because people under our MMP system, no doubt he felt the need to make sure that the coalition partners that we had to deal with were still in the tent as such. So he was very good at managing coalitions, and he's very good at managing people. So I found that good. I thought the one downside, I always felt that it was very much either you're in the tent or not in the tent. And often, even though we personally got on fine, I often felt a little bit of an outsider. And that is possibly because of my often forthright views and my inability to just sit there and take it and shut up. So my face normally shows everything I'm thinking anyway. So I think, but generally I think he was, we could always rely on him to be able to do his job. You know, he's very capable.
I also want to go back to something you mentioned a bit earlier about child poverty. You know, I found it very surprising in New Zealand that it actually has one of the worst rates of child poverty and infant mortality in the developed world. I think both you and Jacinda Ardern have this target of halving child poverty in New Zealand by 2030. That said, studies in fact show that under the Jacinda administration, child poverty has not fallen, and it's still a clear cause for concern. How do you intend to reduce the number of children in poverty in New Zealand?
Well, it's one of those situations where most people in New Zealand do very well. So it's not just the haves and the have-nots. It's actually most people are in the having and getting along reasonably well. the issue is that we have, particularly in parts of New Zealand, a culture of gangs, violence, intergenerational welfare dependency, intergenerational family violence, and children are born into homes where there is without hope. So that is, I think, true in most parts of the world. But the difference clearly has to be, and a way through has to be, around education. Because where we do see that where children have, or adults have, got away from that sort of lifestyle and that sort of grinding poverty and hopelessness, is it's through education. And one of the things that I think the current government is failing massively on is on education and education standards. We tried to improve it with a thing called national standards when we came in, and that was all around making sure that children could read and write and their parents knew what was happening at schools. First thing Labor did when they got in was to get rid of any of this required reporting to parents. So most schools do report, but they can report on, Johnny is happy, rather than Johnny can't read. So we do need to, I feel very strong that we need a visionary plan around education. So Paul Goldsmith has been, as our MP with Portfolio for Education, has been charged with being as radical as possible to bring about the best possible results, because education has to be it, because it's the only way forward for kids to get out of the situations they have. And I think sometimes we often talk a lot about families, and we often talk about families being the answer. For some people, I will controversially but truthfully say families are the problem. And those are the families where they hold children back, they hold each other back, and they don't want to see people get ahead. It's also true that the families living in poverty, children living in poverty, are overwhelmingly Maori, the Indigenous people of New Zealand, First Peoples as such, representing around 15% of the population. Now, that is not to say that all Maori, or even most Maori, are in that case, but there is a significant number who are. And partly we have been very committed as a party, and when we've been in government, to treaty settlements with different iwi, or what you'd call tribes, around wrongdoings when colonisation occurred and land was in many cases taken off people. Those treaty settlements are, I believe, crucial to helping people to, number one, get access to capital, but also to move from a sense of grievance into a sense of opportunity. And we've seen that in parts of the country, particularly in our South Island, where it's been staggering to see the way in which Maori-led tourism has been instrumental in bringing back growth into an area, but also for the people who are members of that particular iwi, which is the Maori name for a tribe. So I just think that these are big issues for us, and no country sort of seems to get it perfect. But the current government's plans of just putting up wages isn't necessarily going to do it. We need to have more productivity, and productivity growth has slowed in New Zealand significantly, and even before COVID. So that's where we see the use of technological advances and changes as being a way forward for us. And we do have a population that is highly technologically literate. We're often seen as a microcosm, as a mini market for some of the big IT companies to use tech on, to trial it out for us. So we have opportunities there, and being at the bottom of the world, being with the most beautiful environment and not huge high density, it's amazing the number of bigger high tech investors who want to come to New Zealand. So we've got opportunities there.
You touched on something there that I know is a huge talking point in the UK, and that's immigration. We're obviously leaving the European Union. We have the opportunity to decide our own immigration policy, and it's causing a lot of debate and a lot of conversation here on what that should look like. How do you think New Zealand's immigration policy is, and are there areas in which you think there can be some improvements?
Yes, so we've had restricted immigration for many, many years, and we've been able to do that because, again, we are an island at the bottom of the world. I think many people have seen us, when we were in government anyway, Nationals in government, we introduced basically high net worth visas for people to bring capital into New Zealand and skills. That had varying success, mostly relatively good, some not so good. But what New Zealanders, and we always have to be careful of, is that there is a general fearfulness of too much what people would see as foreign intervention or big money coming in and making things more difficult for New Zealanders to buy. Since I've been in politics, it's been a common refrain, and Simon O'Connor will have heard it many times, of we can't have these foreigners coming in to buy our land. And I can't help myself occasionally just saying, and where are they taking it? And the answer is nowhere. And actually, we're all ultimately foreigners in New Zealand. Even Maori, the first people here 800 to 1,000 years ago, which in English terms is pretty not that long ago. So if you consider those migrations. So I just think it's really important that we take people along with us. So are people interested in big money, big skilled people coming in? Yes. Do they worry? Yes. But the immigration, we need to be very targeted, I think, on skills that we need. And we need high-tech skills. We need engineering skills. We need people in the IT industry, and we need also people even to pick fruit, because we have quite a large horticultural sector. So from one end of the spectrum to the other, but we actually need people who want to work. And unfortunately, we do have unemployment here, not as much as many countries. We do very well, but we also have a lot of people who aren't even on an unemployment benefit because they're on a sickness or benefit. And so we need to make sure we bring people in who want to work. And most immigrants, I mean, I'm a very pro-immigrant immigration person, come to work and actually generally are a positive influence on any nation. And I think, this is one of the things that tends to get forgotten. The most dynamic and exciting economies and countries in the world are often those that have significant migration coming into them.
It's an interesting point there on wanting immigrants who actually come to the country and want to work. I mean, it's been a massive contentious point in the UK, and it was one of the main reasons cited for us leaving the European Union was on immigration policy. And it's interesting to see how you guys have had a restrictive policy for a very long time. I want to touch on something you mentioned there on nationalism, because it's again another thing that we talk a lot about in the UK, and it's almost has a very negative connotation in our country, and I think it's something that our party aren't, the Conservative Party don't necessarily like that narrative. I think the idea of being patriotic and being proud to be British is an important part of being British and being in this country. Do you think that's an issue New Zealand faces also? Is it something in the sense of, take yourself as an example, to be pro-nationalist, often it comes people with different stigmas and different, there's straight away the argument is anti-immigration or whatever the particular things. Is that an issue you face with the National Party in New Zealand?
Not so much the National Party, because we are very broad church when it comes to this. Certainly our politics, I believe, in New Zealand has been unhelpfully skewed along a path of a them and us type mentality, whether it's about immigrants, whether it's about people with more money than those who don't, all of these things. And we had until the last election, I mean, there's one good thing that came out of the last election was the end of a party called New Zealand First. It is probably more akin to the British National Party, or, you know, in terms of a quite divisive around ethnicity, race, and all guised up in the, you know, really just caring about New Zealand. We saw a lot of anti-Chinese New Zealander sentiment coming from them, and then picked up by the Labour Party when they were last in opposition. These are, you know, quite, in my opinion, if it's actually a bit of a stain on New Zealand's political history, in my opinion. And the good thing is that they got thrown out of government, out of both government and parliament, because they were in a coalition with Labour. There were good things that they did, but ultimately that sort of attracting those who feel that they're disenfranchised and feeling that the world has moved on and they haven't moved on with it, was actually always going to be a problem for our country. And we've had them in politics since 1993.
Right.
And
that moves on nicely to my next question. I saw your State of the Nation speech. You shared the 5 sort of main priorities: COVID-19, the economic recovery, hardship and public safety, housing and infrastructure, as well as world-class cities, the tech sector and opportunities post-COVID. I thought I'd give you an opportunity to discuss that further with some of our viewers in the UK in particular.
Right, well, I think we all know about COVID, so I think let's move past that one. But what I see with the fact that New Zealand has ultra-fast broadband, which is one of the best infrastructure projects that I can think of in the last decade. And we brought that in when we were last in government. It was rolled out around the country very successfully, but it enabled most people to be able to work from home through use of broadband, ultra-fast broadband. So what it struck me that every crisis is an opportunity to think about how we can do things differently. And one of the things that I learned through the campaign is just how many high-tech businesses we have in New Zealand. So for instance, there's a business that makes robots that seeds fields with seed. So it's made for the US market on their big planes. So instead of bringing in illegal workers to work backbreaking work, there's a robot that works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the only human intervention is to make sure they have enough seed in the robot. So this is the sort of thing that we're seeing being made in New Zealand now. Other countries are doing things too, but clearly I think the tech area is as absolutely important, and tech revolution as important to us now as the Industrial Revolution was, or let's say even the combustion engine. These are incredibly important times, and every country is seeking to have the resources to do this, to have people to do it, the education to do it. And for a little country like ours, we have certain advantages, and one is that we can attract people who are interested in a lifestyle, plus also have both capital and the ability to help us with it. But we also have another, and that is that New Zealand, as I'm sure you know, is we're little, but we are a giant when it comes to agriculture. And it's not that we have any huge advantages. I mean, we have relatively temperate climate, but where we really have the advantage is that we have had to innovate. So it was a New Zealander in the 1870s who invented and started the first of the frozen sheep shipments to the UK. He was a Chinese immigrant, by the way. So came for the goldfields and ended up doing this. So we've had to innovate, and we've had to constantly be under threat that we're always trying to do something differently. If we take kiwi fruit, well known in the world, entirely taking the Chinese gooseberry, and New Zealanders changing and using technology and research and development to turn it into an entirely new thing, which is now known as kiwi or kiwi fruit around the world. So that's actually another example of success. We have an attitude around technology and science and research, which means we can do things. And I hate that term, punching above our weight, but we can be cleverer because we have to be. So we have opportunities. So when I talk about the world-class cities technology, this is a real passion. And why is it a real passion? Because we can't just say, oh, we always have a quarter-acre plot that we have a house on. We have to think differently. We really lack public transport. People live in London or other parts of the UK, and they come back home to New Zealand and say, why can't we have a subway system like London? Well, we've got this. We don't have population density, but we can do something differently. And whether that's in technology around, trackless trains, whether it's around driverless cars, drone use for couriers, all these sorts of things. This is something I'm extremely passionate about. And I just see it as part of our visionary look for the future, rather than saying, well, we want to go back to what we used to have back in the 1970s. We can do a lot better than that. Housing is part of that too. So when I look at housing, house prices in New Zealand, particularly Auckland, are at astronomical levels. We are now in Auckland, one of the least affordable housing areas in the developed world, or in the world. And if you look at salary to house prices, it's like London. And that's ridiculous. And a lot of that is based on the fact that people feel that housing is a safe haven for money. The current very low interest rates are encouraging that. And because too, I believe that we've had very restrictive land practices for the last 30 years around where houses can be built, the style of those houses, what can happen, very, very restrictive. And we really do need to adapt and adopt to that. And part of the asking people to have higher density housing, for instance, is making sure that they also have access to green spaces, high technology, all those sorts of things. So I don't know, Simon, if you'd like to sort of comment on that. Simon lives in a nice leafy area, as do I. Everyone likes everything just the same, but ultimately we do need to change. But Simon might want to add something to that, because his constituents all are enjoying very high value of housing, but unfortunately their children can't afford to buy a house.
Yeah, it's an illustration of one of the great conundrums. New Zealand is changing fundamentally and across a range of issues. I will admit, in my mid-40s, and from where New Zealand was as a child, the way it thought about things to how it engaged with the world has certainly changed big time. So we're not static as a country. I think a lot of the things which Judith has touched on illustrate that. But we do have a conundrum in that you have a set of New Zealanders who have done particularly well. They've worked hard, they've saved their money, they've invested prudently, and now they're enjoying that. But we have a little gap developing, and particularly for our younger generation coming through. So the likes of my stepkids, for example, who are struggling to get on to the housing ladder, and using that as an example, and in very crude terms, they're competing with a wealthier set of Kiwis. So it becomes impossible. You go to a house auction, for example, and you're up against the 70-year-old with 4 houses already, and the 25-year-old who's been struggling to pull the deposit together. How exactly you fix it is a point of major discussion for the National Party, and it won't surprise you that being a conservative or a centre-right leaning party, you're not wanting to radically change the market in a way that's going to harm one side at the cost of another. So we're not a party that wants to start massive taxes and to punish people for saving for their properties, but equally, how do we, and we've done some experiments in this area quite successfully, of how do you provide some inducements through the Crown to the likes of first home buyers. And it's not often advocated, and I'll finish on this, that actually under the last national government, the rate of first home ownership remained pretty static, actually. The impression that things were really, really bad, but through a series of initiatives that Judith was also part of, things were relatively stable. But more will need to be done, but the key point is that a good centre-right approach doesn't try to punish one group of people over another. And we'll wrestle with that conundrum for a little while in opposition, but then hopefully in government soon.
Thank you for both your insights, since I know housing's another big talking point in the UK. I'll pass it quickly to Paul, who has a question for you both.
Thank you both for a really interesting discussion so far. I had kind of a general question that I thought we couldn't really leave without asking. It's about, obviously, the Commonwealth and where you both see New Zealand's role in the Commonwealth and where you would like to see, I guess, the Commonwealth kind of moving forward, and how you would kind of like to see it working as an organisation.
Well, thank you for that. I think Simon and I would share views on this one, that the Commonwealth is a very, it's a very diverse group, obviously, of countries, but with a shared background and history in terms of certainly Britain. To me, the Commonwealth is opportunities for us. So we have very focused in the Pacific, Asia Pacific, as a trading bloc, you could say. Well, not so much a bloc, but an area. And we've become very dependent on China when it comes to trade. So we have about a third of our produce goes to China. It has probably helped us through has definitely helped us through the global financial crisis, and has certainly helped us in terms of the COVID response. None of that means, though, that we suddenly ignore the fact that we are part of the Commonwealth, which has as I said, the concepts, the rule of law, a shared history, and understanding of Westminster-style democracy. But we could say it's very diverse, lots of different parts of it. It's a club as such, or a family. But then again, we could say Europe is extremely diverse and has spent most of the 20th century fighting each other, and the centuries before that too. So, if we can, as a Commonwealth, I think, understand each other better and see opportunities for us all, not only in trade, but in people movement. I think most New Zealanders would have very little contact or connection through to, say, Africa, where there are significant numbers of people who are part of the Commonwealth. I think that's an opportunity for us as a country to look more to, say, countries in Africa, particularly countries that are well functioning. And I often notice when I am in the UK, when we were allowed to travel, just how connected the UK is to Africa and the Middle East, while New Zealand tends to not so much be there. But it is important, I think, for us, of our sovereignty, that New Zealand explores not only other trading relationships, but actually other relationships generally. And we have to be part of that. Otherwise, we are just a little country at the bottom of the earth with 5 million people.
Thank you for that.
I might add very quickly, the Commonwealth is great. And conceptually, I think, particularly liberal democracies need to combine together more. In other words, more, if you will, commonwealths, more groupings is better, because we're seeing the opposite in other parts of the world, where there's actually a deliberate attempt to break things down. So the Commonwealth's incredibly positive from my point of view. Well, it's all of what Judith said too, our commonality for 16 of us in particular, the same head of state judicial systems. I think there's a real opportunity for the New Zealand Parliament here to leverage on that more. It's only a small thing, but we have lots of interparliamentary travel. I've argued to this time unsuccessfully that we should preference the Commonwealth, not exclusively, but it's a little bit of what Judith was saying there. Let's engage our Commonwealth partners in the likes of Africa. But it's also, for me, quite important that because the Commonwealth, 56 nations, one of you will pull me up if I've got that wrong, quite big. And some of those links are tenuous, which is why, again, the likes of CANZUK really come into itself. In other words, the Commonwealth's good, but groups within that is not harmful as well. But it's something to be celebrated in a world which is trying to divide, that actually 50 plus nations are willing to get together and celebrate their commonality.
I think one of the things I've noticed, having been in government here, or even in Parliament and government under both, when there's been first a Labour government and then a Conservative government in the UK, is a different attitude towards both New Zealand and the Commonwealth. I make no, apologies for this. When Labour was in government in the UK, not once in 15 years did we have a visit from a foreign secretary to New Zealand. And that was extraordinary. And having met with ministers there under Tony Blair's and then Gordon Brown's governments, there was no interest in the Commonwealth that I could see, and certainly not in us. But once David Cameron came in, the Conservatives, we had William Hague visiting within a nanosecond, and then coming the next year. And it was reminded to us that it wasn't the Foreign Office, it was the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And to me, that difference was staggering. And I think that one of the things that people tend to forget is that in a little country like ours, is that having served in the same wars together, having been at the same things, having my father served in World War II, New Zealand was always there, as was Australia. And we found the time of being shoved to the side as some sort of old colonial relic, somewhat uncomfortable. So we much prefer, well, I personally much prefer it when we now go back to the UK when we can, and people actually do take the calls and they do want to see us and we do want to chat.
That's great to hear. We're obviously a bit biased on our platform with the Commonwealth, but it's good to it's good to hear that reaction from you guys in New Zealand to notice the difference. And it's worth noting at some point, our parliamentary chair of this organisation is Helen Grant, and she's actually the special envoy for Nigeria. So that may be something that we can talk about in the future, arranging that sort of conversation. So we are actively building closer ties with Africa, and I think you can see on social media what Liz Truss is doing, especially in India and some of the other Commonwealth countries. My final question before I let you guys go, I know you've got probably a busy day ahead. There's been a lot of talk on the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as more simply the CPTPP. I'm not sure if that's much more simple, but and in the last couple of weeks, the UK has announced it, is planning to apply to join that free trade agreement. New Zealand are obviously already part of that agreement. What are your thoughts on the CPTPP, and do you think it's a wise move for the UK to join?
Well, I think it's always a wise move. The New Zealand has constantly been seeking and being part of free trade agreements, and it's not, obviously they need to work for each country, but in terms of, if you're looking at a block of nations, not only in Asia but also right around the Pacific, in South America, as well as through North America, and unfortunately US pulled out of it, but it's a very important trading bloc, and from our point of view, it is worthwhile to be part of it. we are the first developed nation or first world country to have had a free trade agreement with China, for instance, and we're now getting an updated one. But from our point of view, these are the ways in which you build relationships, but it's also the way for everyone that we do that. I mean, that's why pretty much UK went into Europe, wasn't it? Was for free trade. And then you ended up with highly restricted people telling you how to make a sausage type trade. So I think these are the things that will work. We're also very much like a UK-New Zealand free trade agreement. And even from opposition, we would be cheering that on because we are a party of free trade.
Well, thank you for your time today, both of you. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and hopefully we can do this someday in person and the not too distant future. I'll pass it over to Paul now.
Just a big thank you once again to both of you and to everyone for joining. Our next event is with another colleague of yours, Simon Bridges, on Sunday UK time, Monday morning in New Zealand. And then we have, of course, on the 4th of March, John Howard, the former Australian Prime Minister. But thank you both, Judith and Simon, for joining. It's been a fantastic discussion, and obviously we look forward to hopefully having an in-person event sometime in the future.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening in your case.